The snow fell silent over Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. On Christmas Eve 1944, each flake a whisper against the barbed wire that separated one world from another. Inside Barracks 7, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto sat cross-legged on his bunk, holding a photograph so worn the edges had turned soft as cloth. His daughter's face smiled up at him, frozen at age 4, though she would be 7 now, a stranger growing up in Hiroshima without knowing if her father still breathed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The smell hit him first. It came through the gaps in the wooden walls, carried on winter wind that had crossed Lake Michigan before finding this temporary city of the displaced. Turkey. Roasting turkey with herbs he couldn't name but recognized in his bones as celebration, as family, as everything this place was not supposed to be. His hands trembled, and the photograph slipped from his fingers, landing face down on the rough wool blanket. Yamamoto-san. The voice belonged to Private Kenji Sato, barely 19, who still flinched at sudden sounds and whose nightmares woke half the barracks 3 times a week. The Americans are preparing something. The guards are smiling. I don't trust it. Takeshi retrieved the photograph, tucking it carefully into the wooden box he'd carved from scraps, the only possession he'd created rather than been issued. The Americans smile at many things, Sato-kun. It is their way. But his own voice carried doubt like a stone. Outside, Captain James Morrison stood in the camp commander's office, staring at a requisition form that had traveled from Washington through layers of military bureaucracy to land on his desk 3 days before Christmas. The order was simple, bizarre, and potentially dangerous. Prepare a traditional Christmas dinner for all prisoners. Spare no expense within reason. Include elements that might remind them of home. Document reactions. Sir, with respect, this is insane. Lieutenant Patricia O'Brien, the camp supply officer, held her own copy of the order as if it might bite. We're talking about enemy combatants. Men who killed our boys in the Pacific. And we're supposed to what? Make them nostalgic. Morrison was 43, old enough to have fought in the First War, young enough to understand this one was different. The order comes from the War Department's psychological division. Something about the Geneva Conventions and maintaining morale. Or maybe someone in Washington thinks kindness is a weapon. He rubbed his temples. Either way, Lieutenant, we have 2 days to turn this camp's mess hall into something that doesn't make men want to die. The preparations began in secret, or as secret as anything could be in a camp where every unusual activity rippled through both guard and prisoner populations like electricity through water. Corporal Sarah Chen, one of the few Chinese-American personnel at McCoy, found herself assigned to special duty in the kitchen, not because of her heritage, but because she spoke passable Japanese, learned from her grandmother who had lived in Osaka before immigrating in 1908. She stood now in the mess hall kitchen, watching cooks transform military rations into something approaching celebration. But her mind was elsewhere, on a conversation she'd overheard between 2 prisoners during her rounds the previous week. They'd been discussing their wives, their children, the weight of absence that pressed down like atmosphere. One had wept silently, shoulders shaking, while the other stared at the winter sky with eyes that saw different stars. "Chen, you listening?" Chef Sergeant Marcus Williams, a man from Louisiana who could make sawdust taste like Sunday dinner, waved a wooden spoon at her. "I need you to figure out what these men miss. Not just food home. What did Christmas smell like in Japan? What did it taste like? Because if we're doing this, we're doing it right." Sarah thought of her grandmother's stories, of celebrations that blended Shinto traditions with adopted Western customs, of how the Japanese had taken Christmas and made it their own thing. Not religious for most, but special, a time of light in dark winter. "Strawberry shortcake," she said suddenly. "And fried chicken. I know it sounds strange, but in Japan, Christmas means Kentucky Fried Chicken and strawberry shortcake. It's what families save money for." Williams stared at her. "You're telling me we need to fry chicken for men who come from the land of teriyaki? I'm telling you that memory isn't logical, Sergeant. It's Kentucky Fried Chicken because it's rare, special, chosen. It's what you eat when you're happy, when your family is whole." She paused. "And we won't have strawberries. but we might have something that reminds them why strawberries mattered. In Barrack 7, Takeshi gathered the men for evening count, but his mind wandered to Christmases past. Not in Japan, where the holiday was pleasant but peripheral, but to the strange Christmas he'd experienced in 1940 while studying engineering at UCLA. His American roommate, David Chen, no relation to the Corporal, had invited him home to San Francisco, where David's mother had prepared a feast that blended Chinese, Japanese, and American traditions in ways that should have clashed but somehow sang. He remembered David's mother placing a hand on his shoulder, her eyes understanding something he hadn't spoken. "Homesickness is hunger with no cure," she'd said in Mandarin, which Takeshi understood better than English then. "But we feed it anyway, because the trying matters." David was dead now, killed at Bataan. Takeshi had learned this from a guard who'd recognized the name when Takeshi mentioned it during processing. The guard had looked at him with something complicated, not quite hatred, not quite sympathy. "War makes enemies of friends," the guard had said. "That's why it's hell." The barracks smelled of unwashed men, cheap soap, and resignation. 43 prisoners lived in this space designed for 30, their belongings sparse as winter branches. Some played Go with stones carved from buttons. Others wrote letters that might never be sent, practicing characters they feared forgetting. Corporal Hiro Nakamura, a farmer from Hokkaido, tended a small plant he'd somehow kept alive in a tin can, a miracle of determination that made Takeshi's chest ache. "Yamamoto-san, do you think we'll see home again?" This from Private Ichiro Tanaka, whose left hand ended at the wrist, courtesy of Guadalcanal and a mortar shell that had killed everyone else in his unit. Takeshi looked at the faces turned toward him. Young men and old, educated and simple, all wearing the same expression of patient suffering. "I think," he said carefully, "that we will see many things we don't expect, and some of those things might surprise us." Outside, the snow deepened. Camp Morrison watched it through his window, thinking of his own son, somewhere in Germany with Patton's Third Army, probably cold, probably scared, probably not getting turkey for Christmas either. The war had scattered families like dandelion seeds, and nobody knew where they'd land or if they'd take root. His phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Richard Barrett from the War Department. "Morrison, I need to know you understand the purpose of this exercise." "Honestly, sir, I'm not sure I do." Barrett's sigh crackled through the line. "We're not being kind, Captain. We're being smart. These men will go home eventually, next year, maybe the year after. When they do, they'll tell stories. We want those stories to include moments when America showed them humanity. Not because we're soft, but because propaganda works both ways. You're not feeding prisoners, Morrison. You're feeding the future." After the call, Morrison sat in darkness, watching snow accumulate on the wire. He thought about his son, about the Japanese prisoners, about the terrible calculus of war where kindness became strategy and every gesture carried weight beyond itself. In the kitchen, Sarah Chun supervised the preparation of something unprecedented. They had turkey, yes, enormous birds that would feed hundreds. But they also had chicken, which William's team would fry in a style borrowed from his Louisiana grandmother. They had flour for cakes, and while strawberries were impossible in Wisconsin winter, they had preserved cherries that might, if prepared with enough care, remind men of fruit eaten in happiness. But it was the small things that made Sarah's throat tight. Someone had requisitioned Japanese tea, real tea, not the bitter camp swill. Someone had found sake, probably from a San Francisco import shop now shuttered by war regulations. Someone had approved the purchase of rice flour for mochi, though none of the American cooks knew how to use it. "Chun, show me." Williams stood beside her, holding the flour like it might explode. "I can fry anything, grill anything, roast anything God created. But this is yours." So she showed him, her hands remembering what her grandmother had taught her 20 years before. The flour mixed with water and sugar, steamed until it became something between solid and liquid, pounded until it achieved the texture of clouds made edible. Williams watched with the concentration of a man learning to defuse bombs. "My grandmother used to say mochi is the soul of Japanese celebration," Sarah said, her hands working. "Not the body, that's the feast, but the soul. Because it takes time, patience, and it's meant to be shared. She paused. I haven't made this since she died. Why now? Williams asked. Because, Sarah said, shaping the mochi with hands that shook slightly. My grandmother would have wanted me to remember that enemies are just strangers who haven't eaten together yet. The night before Christmas, Takeshi couldn't sleep. He stood at the barracks window, watching guards patrol, their breath clouding in cold air. One guard, young, maybe 20, stamped his feet and blew on his hands. Takeshi recognized the gesture. He'd done the same thing during winter exercises in Manchuria, before the war had devoured everything. Behind him, Kenji Sato whispered in his sleep, words Takeshi couldn't make out but understood. They were all haunted men, prisoner and guard alike, going through motions of normalcy while the world burned. Tomorrow, Corporal Nakamura said from his bunk, startling Takeshi. Tomorrow the Americans will do something. I can feel it. What do you think it is? Nakamura touched the tin can where his plant struggled toward life. I think they want to remind us we're human. I'm not sure whether to be grateful or terrified. Takeshi returned to his bunk, retrieved the photograph of his daughter, and held it against his chest. Somewhere across an ocean of war and confusion, she was sleeping. Or maybe not sleeping. Maybe staring at her own winter sky, wondering about a father who existed only in photographs and fading memory. The question that haunted him, the one he couldn't shake, was simple and terrible. If the Americans showed him kindness tomorrow, would it make him more homesick or less? Would it feed the hunger or make it sharper? He didn't know. The not knowing was its own kind of prison. Morning came slowly to Camp McCoy, dawn bleeding through clouds that promised more snow. Takeshi rose at 5:30 a.m., as he had every morning for 18 months. His body calibrated to routine the way flowers turn toward sun. The barracks stirred around him, coughs, groans, the shuffle of men preparing for another day of existence measured in roll calls and work details. He washed his face in water so cold it felt like punishment, then knelt before his bunk for the morning ritual. Not prayer, exactly. Takeshi had never been religious, but a moment of deliberate thought about the person he wanted to remain. He visualized his daughter's face, his wife's hands, his parents' garden in Hiroshima, where plum blossoms had bloomed every spring like clockwork. These memories were stones he carried, heavy but precious. Yamamoto-san, you're doing that thing again. Hiro Nakamura stretched, his farmer's body still strong despite months of camp rations. The thing where you disappear into your head. It's the only place I can go without permission, Takeshi said, but he smiled to soften it. Their work detail that day was snow removal, backbreaking labor that the guards considered character building and the prisoners considered proof of either American sadism or stupidity. Takeshi pulled on his camp-issued coat, too thin for Wisconsin winter, and lined up with 40 other men for the walk to the equipment shed. Captain Morrison watched the prisoners file past, their breath forming small clouds of evidence that they still lived. He recognized Yamamoto, the quiet one who'd been an engineer before the war, who carried himself with a dignity that made the guards uncomfortable because it reminded them that uniforms didn't erase personhood. Captain, sir. Corporal Chen fell into step beside him. The preparations are complete. Dinner will be served at 1800 hours. We've arranged the mess hall with, well, you should see it yourself. Morrison followed her to the mess hall, and what he found there stopped him mid-stride. The usual austere cafeteria had been transformed. Someone had strung paper lanterns, probably made by guards' families. Someone had arranged pine boughs, their scent filling the space with forest and winter. The tables, usually bare metal, wore white cloths salvaged from storage. And in the center of each table sat a small arrangement of, "Are those origami cranes?" Morrison asked. 63 of them, Chen said. The prisoners made them from newspaper. One of the guards brought them to me this morning, said the men had been working on them for days. I think they knew something was happening. Morrison picked up one of the cranes, marveling at the precision of folds made from material designed to deliver news, now transformed into symbol. They're hoping, he said. Or they're homesick, Chen replied. Maybe both. In the snow, Takeshi pushed a shovel through accumulation that had no end. His hands, once soft with study, had calloused into workers' hands. His back, once straight with youth, had learned to curve against labor. But his mind stayed sharp through discipline. He thought about engineering problems from his UCLA days, working through differential equations in his head while his body performed mindless work. He thought about bridge designs he'd been developing before Pearl Harbor had turned him from student to enemy alien to prisoner. He thought about whether those designs still mattered in a world being redesigned by bombs. Yamamoto-san, what do you miss most? Private Sato leaned on his shovel, young face serious. About home. I mean, it was the question every prisoner asked eventually, and the answer was never simple. The sound of my wife humming while she cooked, Takeshi said finally. She couldn't carry a tune, but she hummed anyway. I used to tease her about it. His voice caught. I would give anything to hear that terrible humming again. Sato nodded slowly. My mother made the best tamagoyaki, sweet egg roll. She'd wake up early to make it fresh for my father. I can still smell it, that smell of eggs and soy sauce and sugar mixing. Sometimes I dream about it and wake up crying. Around them, other conversations blossomed like winter flowers. Men trading memories as if memories were currency, which perhaps they were. Hiro Nakamura talked about his farm, about soil so black it looked like night, about planting rice in perfect rows while his daughters sang. Ichiro Tanaka, one-handed and forever marked by war, spoke of teaching calligraphy to village children, his intact hand making characters in the air. These were the hours that sustained them, not the meals or the shelter, but the moments when they could remember they had been someone before becoming prisoners, that they might be someone again after. At lunch, they received the usual watery soup, hard bread, weak tea. The prisoners ate methodically, without complaint, because complaining changed nothing. But Takeshi noticed whispers spreading through the mess hall like wind through grass. Something was different. The guards were tense with anticipation. The cooks kept glancing at the prisoners with expressions that might have been guilt or excitement. Tonight, Kenji Sato whispered. Something happens tonight. After lunch, Morrison called a meeting of his senior staff. Lieutenant O'Brien, Sergeant Williams, Corporal Chen, and a dozen others crowded into his office, standing because there weren't enough chairs, breathing air thick with tension. Tonight we feed enemy prisoners a Christmas feast, Morrison said without preamble. Some of you think this is wrong. Some of you lost people in the Pacific. I understand. He paused, meeting each person's eyes. But orders are orders, and more than that, this is an opportunity to be better than we have to be. The war will end. These men will go home. The question is, what will they say about us? That we were cruel when we didn't have to be, or that we were human when we could have been monsters? Nobody spoke immediately. Then Williams raised his hand like a schoolboy. Sir, I lost a cousin at Wake Island. Japanese killed him. But my grandmother always said hatred's a fire that burns the person holding it. So I'm gonna cook the best damn meal those men ever had. Not for them, but for my cousin. Because he'd want me to be bigger than the war. Chen spoke next. My grandmother fled Japan because of persecution. But she taught me their language, their food, their customs. She said culture isn't flag or politics. It's the stuff that makes us remember we're human. So tonight, I'm honoring her. One by one, the others spoke, or nodded, or simply stood straighter. Morrison felt something shift in the room, not agreement exactly, but commitment to trying something difficult. In the afternoon, prisoners were given unexpected free time. No explanation, just an announcement that work details were canceled and they should rest. The barracks buzzed with speculation ranging from optimistic to paranoid. Some thought it was a trap. Others thought inspection. A few dared to hope for kindness. Takeshi used the time to write a letter he knew might never reach its destination. Dear Yuki, he wrote to his wife in careful characters. Today is Christmas Eve in this strange American camp. I think of you constantly, of Sakura, of the life we built before the world went mad. I wonder if you received my previous letters, if you know I'm alive. The not knowing is harder than the imprisonment. He paused, brush hovering over paper. What could he say that wouldn't be censored, that wouldn't make her worry more? The Americans here are not cruel. he wrote finally. They are confused, I think, about how to be captors. Some seem to want us to be monsters to justify their actions. Others seem to want us to be human, which frightens them more. Tonight they are preparing something, I don't know what. Part of me hopes it is kindness. Part of me fears it. He signed the letter, folded it carefully, and placed it in the box with the others. 37 letters, none sent, all written. They were messages in bottles thrown into an ocean of silence. But the writing itself was the point. The writing proved he still could shape words, still could articulate love across impossible distance. Evening approached like a held breath. At 1,700 hours, the prisoners were told to wash and put on their cleanest clothes. They were told dinner would be special. They were told nothing else. And in that silence, every fear and hope multiplied. Takeshi dressed carefully, smoothing his prison uniform, wishing he had better clothes for whatever was coming. Around him, men did the same, veterans of war preparing for a different kind of battle, one where the weapons were unknown and the stakes unclear. I'm scared, Kenji Sato admitted, his 19-year-old face naked with vulnerability. What if it's bad? What if they're... Then we face it, Takeshi said firmly. Together, like we face everything. At 1,745 hours, the guards opened the barracks doors and gestured for the prisoners to follow. They walked through snow that had paused its falling, through twilight that turned the camp purple and blue, toward the mess hall that glowed with more light than usual. The doors opened. The smell hit them first, turkey and sage and something sweet, something that smelled like celebration, like the opposite of war. The prisoners stopped collectively, a wave breaking against shore, unable to process what their senses reported. The mess hall had transformed. The white tablecloths, the paper lanterns, the pine boughs, the origami cranes, their own cranes returned and displayed with respect. And the food. Tables groaned with food. Golden turkeys, fried chicken, bowls of rice, vegetables in colors that didn't exist in camp rations, bread that steamed with freshness, and desserts. Actual desserts that made grown men's mouths water. But it was the small details that broke them. The cups of real tea. The bottle of sake at each table, impossible and present. The small mochi cakes, imperfectly made but recognizable. The American guards standing with expressions of determined welcome, as if they'd decided, for one night, to forget the word enemy. Takeshi felt his knees weaken. Behind him, he heard Kenji Sato make a sound that might have been a sob. Hiro Nakamura gripped Takeshi's shoulder hard enough to hurt. Ichiro Tanaka, one-handed veteran, covered his face with his remaining hand and wept. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the hall, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, and spoke in English that Corporal Chen translated into Japanese. Tonight, we remember that war is temporary, but humanity is permanent. This meal is offered in the spirit of Christmas, which asks us to see the divine in every person. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also men, and tonight you are guests. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, the prisoners moved toward the tables. They sat carefully, as if the chairs might vanish. They stared at the food as if it might be mirage. And when Morrison said, "Please eat," they began, hands trembling, to serve themselves. Takeshi reached for the turkey with hands that shook so violently he nearly knocked over his water glass. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs that transported him instantly to that Christmas in San Francisco 4 years earlier, when David Chen's mother had served a similar bird and told him stories about her own displacement, her own longing for a home that existed only in memory. He took a bite, and the taste was so rich, so far from the bland sustenance of camp rations, that tears blurred his vision. Around the table, 43 men experienced their own private earthquakes. Kenji Sato clutched a piece of fried chicken like it was sacred scripture. Hiro Nakamura spooned rice into his mouth with both hands, shameless in his hunger for flavor. Ichiro Tanaka used his one good hand to bring mochi to his lips, and when he bit down, his whole body convulsed with recognition. "It tastes like my mother's kitchen," someone whispered in Japanese. "It tastes like before," someone else answered. At the next table, Corporal Yoshi Kimura, who had been a teacher in Osaka, began to cry openly. Not quiet tears but wrenching sobs that made his shoulders heave. The American guard standing nearby, a young private named Tommy Mitchell from Iowa, shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene or ignore. The boundary between compassion and duty blurred in the lantern light. Sarah Chun moved through the mess hall with a pitcher of tea, refilling cups, and everywhere she went, she witnessed the same transformation. Men who had worn masks of stoic endurance for months now let those masks crack and fall. Some smiled with wonder. Some wept. Some did both simultaneously, caught between gratitude and grief, between the gift of this moment and the knowledge of everything it wasn't. She reached Takeshi's table and poured tea into his cup. He looked up at her, and his eyes held a question he couldn't articulate. She answered in Japanese, her accent rough but understandable. My grandmother taught me that food is memory made solid. Tonight you have permission to remember. Takeshi nodded, unable to speak. He drank the tea, real tea, not the bitter substitute, and felt it warm a place inside him he'd thought had frozen permanently. At the table's center, someone poured sake into small cups, hands ceremonial despite trembling. They passed the cups around, and Takeshi accepted his, lifting it in a traditional gesture. To absent friends, he said quietly. To families we'll see again, Hiro Nakamura added. To this moment, Kenji Sato finished, which we'll remember when everything else is forgotten. They drank. The sake burned going down, familiar and foreign at once, like hearing your name in a stranger's accent. But not everyone at Camp McCoy experienced Christmas dinner as transcendence. At a corner table, Sergeant Watanabe sat rigid, refusing to touch his food. He was 45, had been military intelligence, had seen things on Guadalcanal that had carved him hollow. He stared at the turkey with an expression close to hatred. This is manipulation, he said to the men around him, voice hard. They feed us one good meal to make us forget their captors, to make us compliant, grateful. This is psychological warfare. Private Noboru Tanaka, no relation to Ichiro, leaned back in his chair. Or maybe, he said, it's just a good meal. Why does it have to be complicated? Because they're the enemy, Watanabe insisted. Because accepting this kindness means accepting that we were wrong, that they were right, that this war. He stopped, jaw clenched. I won't betray my country by enjoying their food. Around them, other men ate or didn't eat, caught in their own negotiations with pride, politics, and hunger. Some found Watanabe's position honorable. Others found it exhausting. Most were too busy experiencing taste and memory to care about ideology. Captain Morrison observed all of this from the mess hall's edge, documenting reactions in a notebook as ordered. He wrote, prisoner response ranges from overwhelming emotion to suspicious resistance. Majority are visibly moved, several weeping openly, food disappearing rapidly. Atmosphere is complex, joy mixed with sorrow, gratitude mixed with resentment. No hostile incidents. Most prisoners appear disoriented by kindness, as if they've forgotten such thing exists. Beside him, Lieutenant O'Brien muttered, This feels wrong, sir, like we're manipulating them. Maybe we are, Morrison agreed. Or maybe we're just feeding hungry men. Motivation doesn't change the turkey's taste. In the kitchen, Sergeant Williams supervised the distribution of desserts, cherry cakes that approximated Japanese Christmas cake, simple but sweet. He'd made them himself, working through the night, because the idea of disappointing the prisoners felt worse than exhaustion. As he watched the prisoners' faces when the desserts appeared, their eyes widening with childlike wonder, he felt his own throat tighten. I didn't think I had any softness left in me, he said to his assistant cook, a young woman named Rebecca Holloway who'd lost 2 brothers in the Pacific. But watching them eat cake I made, I feel like I just gave them something that matters. Rebecca nodded, wiping her eyes. My brothers would hate this. They'd say these men killed Americans, that they don't deserve cake or kindness. But I keep thinking these men have mothers too. Sisters. Someone somewhere is wondering if they're alive, if they're cold, if they're suffering. And tonight, for a few hours, they're not suffering. That has to count for something. At Takeshi's table, the conversation had turned philosophical. Hiro Nakamura, emboldened by sake and cake, asked the question that haunted all of them. What do we do with this kindness? How do we carry it? We remember it, Takeshi said. When the war ends, when we go home, if we go home, we tell people that our enemies showed us humanity when they didn't have to. We tell our children that the world is more complicated than flags and anthems. But what if this makes us soft? Kenji Sato worried. What if accepting this means we're betraying Japan? Takeshi shook his head. Japan doesn't need our suffering to prove our loyalty. Our country needs us to survive, to return, to rebuild. Refusing kindness doesn't make us stronger. It makes us smaller. Across the room, Sergeant Watanabe stood abruptly, chair scraping against floor. He walked out of the mess hall, leaving his untouched plate behind. Several men watched him go, faces troubled. The joy of the evening fractured slightly, reminded that not all wounds could be healed by turkey and cake. Morrison noticed Watanabe's departure and made a note. Later, he would learn that Watanabe had lost his entire unit on Guadalcanal, had survived only by pretending to be dead beneath his comrades' bodies for 2 days while American soldiers walked past. That kind of trauma didn't dissolve with dinner, no matter how carefully prepared. As the meal progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Guards and prisoners started talking. Not officially, not as part of any program, but spontaneously, as if the food had dissolved some invisible barrier. Private Mitchell, the young guard from Iowa, found himself standing near Hiro Nakamura's table, and Nakamura gestured to an empty chair. "You sit," Nakamura said in broken English. "Food. Plenty." Mitchell hesitated, looking around for permission that wouldn't come. Then he sat, accepting a plate that Nakamura filled with turkey and vegetables. They ate in silence for a moment before Nakamura spoke again. "Farm," he said, pointing to himself. "Rice. You?" "Corn," Mitchell answered. "My family grows corn. And soybeans." They smiled at each other, two farmers separated by war, united by understanding what soil feels like under fingernails. At another table, Corporal Chen found herself in conversation with Corporal Kimura, the former teacher who'd wept earlier. He spoke Japanese and she understood enough to follow. "My daughter would be 12 now," Kimura said. "I haven't seen her since she was 9. I wonder if she remembers my face, my voice, or if I've become a photograph, a story her mother tells." Sarah thought of her own father, who died when she was young, who existed for her now only as impression, as half-remembered warmth. "She remembers," Sarah said. "Children remember love even when they forget details. The love is in their bones." Kimura's face crumpled again, but this time the tears seemed different. Not just grief, but release. "Thank you," he said, "for the food, for speaking our language, for remembering we're fathers and husbands, not just prisoners." The evening stretched toward night. The food dwindled. The conversation deepened. In corners of the mess hall, small miracles occurred. A guard shared photographs of his family, and prisoners admired them without irony. A prisoner demonstrated origami, teaching a guard how to fold paper into crane. Two men discovered they'd both studied at Berkeley before the war, had perhaps passed each other on campus without knowing. But beneath the temporary warmth, the reality of their situation remained. When the meal ended, the prisoners would return to barracks. The guards would return to towers. The wire would still separate them. The war would still rage across oceans, consuming lives with industrial efficiency. Takeshi understood this better than most. He'd studied in America, had loved it, had planned to return after graduation to build bridges, literal bridges, physical structures connecting places. Now the only bridge he could build was this. The memory of a Christmas dinner when enemies had eaten together and, for a few hours, remembered they were human. As the meal drew to a close, Captain Morrison stood and spoke again, Chen translating. "This meal will not end the war. It will not erase what has happened. But perhaps it proves that cruelty is not inevitable, that we can choose, even in small ways, to be better than circumstances require. Tonight you were guests. Tomorrow you will be prisoners again. But what happened here, this is real too. Remember both truths. The prisoners rose, bowing in unison, a gesture of respect that made several guards uncomfortable because it reminded them that respect cut both ways. Then, slowly, they filed out of the mess hall into Wisconsin night, into cold that felt less bitter after warmth, into darkness that felt less absolute after light. Takeshi walked back to Barracks 7 with his hands shoved deep in pockets, his stomach full for the first time in memory, his heart fractured with emotions he couldn't name. Behind him, Kenji Sato hummed, a Japanese folk song, barely audible. Ahead, Hiro Nakamura walked with straighter shoulders. Around them, 43 men carried the same cargo. A memory that would outlive the war, a moment when the world had briefly remembered to be kind. In his bunk that night, Takeshi retrieved the photograph of his daughter and studied her face by moonlight filtering through windows. "Today," he whispered to her image, "our enemies fed us like family. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it changes anything. But I wanted you to know that, even in war, sometimes people choose kindness. Remember that, Sakura. When I tell you stories about this time, remember that it wasn't all darkness." Across the camp, in the guards' quarters, Private Mitchell lay awake, thinking about the farmer who'd shared his table. Morrison sat at his desk, writing his report, trying to find words for something that resisted language. Sarah Chun stared at the ceiling, hearing her grandmother's voice. "Feed people, and you're feeding the future." And in a corner of Barracks 7, Sergeant Watanabe sat with his untouched dignity, wondering if his refusal made him strong or just lonely. Section 4, Reveal and Recognition, continued. The morning after Christmas brought cold clarity and complications. Takeshi woke to find Kenji Sato missing from his bunk, an absence that sent alarm rippling through Barracks 7. Guards discovered him an hour later in the chapel, a small building the prisoners were allowed to use, though most avoided it. Sitting alone in darkness, crying with such violence his body shook. "I can't do this anymore," Sato told Morrison when the captain arrived. The young private's face was ravaged, eyes red, voice broken. "Last night they were kind. Today they're captors again. It's easier when they're just captors. The kindness makes it worse because now I know what I'm missing, what I've lost." Morrison crouched beside the young man, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, "The kindness wasn't meant to hurt you. It was meant to remind you that you're still alive, still human. That matters, Private Sato. Even here, especially here." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sato looked at him with eyes that had seen too much for 19 years. "Does it? Does any of this matter when the war keeps taking everything?" Morrison didn't have an answer. So instead, he sat with Sato in the chapel's cold silence, two men on opposite sides of a war, united by the realization that kindness and cruelty could exist in the same breath, and that navigating between them required a courage no training could teach. In the months that followed Christmas 1944, something fundamental shifted at Camp McCoy. The dinner had cracked open a door that neither guards nor prisoners could fully close. Conversations became more frequent. Guards learned prisoners' names. Prisoners learned guards' stories. The wire still separated them, but its meaning changed, from absolute barrier to necessary boundary, acknowledged but no longer insurmountable. Takeshi found himself in an unexpected role. Translator not just of language but of humanity. When guards struggled to understand why a prisoner wept over a letter, Takeshi explained homesickness in terms they could grasp. When prisoners feared American intentions, Takeshi reminded them of the Christmas dinner, of moments when enemies had chosen compassion. Corporal Chen became a bridge of her own. She organized small exchanges, prisoners teaching guards Japanese phrases, guards teaching prisoners baseball rules. Nothing dramatic, nothing that violated protocols, but small gestures that accumulated like snowfall, eventually transforming the landscape. By spring 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the camp, the atmosphere had evolved. Prisoners and guards stood together listening to the radio announcement, and while they didn't celebrate together, the Pacific War still raged. They acknowledged each other's relief that one front had ended. Hiro Nakamura's plant, the one he'd kept alive in a tin can, bloomed that spring. A single white flower that lasted 3 days. Guards came to see it, marveling at the determination required to coax life from impossible conditions. "That's hope," Private Mitchell said, and Nakamura nodded, understanding transcending language barriers. August 1945 brought endings and beginnings. When Japan surrendered, the prisoners of Camp McCoy gathered in the mess hall, the same hall where they'd eaten Christmas dinner, and listened to the announcement in stunned silence. The war was over. They would go home. Everything they'd survived had led to this moment. Takeshi held his daughter's photograph and wept openly, finally allowing himself to believe he might see her again, might hear his wife's terrible humming, might return to a life that had seemed lost forever. The repatriation process took months. During that time, Takeshi wrote his final letter, one that would actually be sent. "Dear Yuki, I am coming home. I have survived. But I am not the man who left. War changes everyone it touches. I have seen cruelty and kindness, often from the same hands. I have learned that enemies are complicated, that humanity persists even in camps and battlefields, and that a single act of compassion can sustain a man through months of darkness. On Christmas Eve 1944, our captors fed us like family. I will never forget the taste of that turkey, the sweetness of that cake, or the lesson it taught, that we are all capable of choosing kindness, even when we're not required to. I am bringing this lesson home to you, to Sakura, to whatever future we can build from these ruins." In December 1945, Takeshi Yamamoto stepped off a ship in Yokohama harbor. Japan was devastated, Hiroshima was ashes, and his family home was gone. But his wife and daughter had survived, evacuated before the bombing, and when he saw them waiting at the processing center, he ran. Sakura didn't recognize him at first. 3 years had turned her from child to girl, had made him a stranger. But when he knelt before her and whispered, "I promised I'd come home," something in his voice reached through the distance, and she fell into his arms crying, "Papa, Papa, Papa." That night, in a borrowed room in a city rebuilding itself, Takeshi told his family about Camp McCoy, about the cold Wisconsin winters, the daily struggles, the loneliness that had nearly broken him. And then he told them about Christmas dinner, about turkey and fried chicken and mochi made by American hands, about guards who'd chosen compassion, about a meal that had reminded him why survival mattered. "They didn't have to be kind," he told Yuki as she held his hand with fierce intensity. "They could have been cruel. Many were. But on Christmas Eve, they chose differently. They fed us. And in feeding us, they reminded us we were worth feeding." Years later, when Takeshi had rebuilt his life as an engineer, when Sakura had grown and had children of her own, he would tell this story to his grandchildren. He would describe the taste of that turkey, the sweetness of that cake, the warmth of that mess hall on the coldest night of his captivity. "Remember," he would tell them, "that even in war, people can choose kindness. That choice doesn't erase the horror, doesn't justify the suffering, but it proves that we're capable of being better than our worst moments. Your grandfather survived the war, yes, but he was sustained by a Christmas dinner that taught him enemies are just people who haven't broken bread together yet." The photograph of 4-year-old Sakura, carried through months of imprisonment, eventually found a place in a family album. Beside it, Takeshi placed a small origami crane made from newspaper, one of the 63 that had decorated the Camp McCoy mess hall on Christmas Eve 1944. These objects became relics of a time when the world had gone mad, and small acts of human decency had been the only sane response. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, Takeshi received a letter from America. It was from Thomas Mitchell, the young guard from Iowa who'd shared dinner with Hiro Nakamura. Mitchell had spent decades wondering what had happened to the prisoners, whether they'd survived, whether they remembered. "I think of that Christmas often," Mitchell wrote. "It taught me that compassion isn't weakness. It's the hardest kind of strength. I hope you and your family found peace. I hope the war didn't take everything." Takeshi wrote back, "The war took much, but it couldn't take the memory of kindness. That dinner sustained me through the darkest times. It proved that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity." Thank you for being part of that moment. Thank you for remembering that we were men, not just prisoners. They corresponded until Mitchell's death in 1992, two farmers, one of rice, one of corn, united by a Christmas dinner that had happened half a century before, in a camp designed to separate, on a night when separation had briefly dissolved into something like understanding. Takeshi Yamamoto died in 1998, at age 83, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. His final words were to Sakura, "Tell them about the Christmas dinner. Tell them that kindness matters, even when it's difficult, even when it seems pointless. Especially then." And she did. The story passed through generations, a reminder that in humanity's darkest hours, small lights still shine. And sometimes those lights are as simple as turkey, mochi, and the decision to feed hungry men with dignity. The Camp McCoy mess hall where it all happened was demolished in 1956. But the memory survived, carried forward by men who'd eaten there, by families who'd heard the stories, by a world that needed to remember. Cruelty is easy, kindness is hard, and the choice between them defines us more than any flag or anthem ever could.